I'd like to talk to you today about Beinecke's Incunabula collections, which you can see actually on the ground floor of the photo here, the oldest portion of that collection. And before I dive in, I want to give you some context about where this is coming from. Yeah, there we go. So you may have heard Beinecke just hired 6 new curators. We were hired last summer and then had sort of a staggered start in the course of this academic year. And that is a massive change that has offered opportunities to reflect on our collections and how they came to be what they are. I share stewardship of the collection of early books and manuscripts with Dr. Michelle Fairsley, who you see immediately below me in these photos. I lean towards the Western end of the collections, she towards Islamic. But one of the focuses that we share for the collections is a real concern with provenance. And since this winter, we've had student curatorial assistants systematically scouring our institutional records to begin creating bibliographic files or object files on the whole collection. The entire project is going to take years. On my end, the medieval manuscripts having decent files already, I've turned my focus to the Incunabula, and this is also in anticipation of the MEI project on the printing revolution in US collections. And so it's within that context that I've had occasion to think about the history of our Incunabula collection as a whole, where it came from, and when. And so what I'd like to do today is 3 things. 1, to introduce Yale and Beinecke's Incunabula collections, give you a broad sense of how they were acquired, and then with a focus on the earliest acquisitions. And then finally, to turn to the problems of and some possible solutions to doing this provenance research here at both the Beinecke and at Yale. So then let me start with the collections very broadly. Here you see Marjorie Wynne, our former rare book librarian, shelving the Incunabula. And when I said we were looking at the ground floor of the library, she shelved those books and they are still there since the 60s. Yale holds one of the largest collections of Incunabula in the US. We're behind the Library of Congress, the Huntington, and Harvard. You can see approximate numbers on the screen here. There are issues with these numbers. I can't differentiate between fragments and full books. I can't differentiate between made-up copies, especially when you have made-up volumes, either textual or physical. And it still kind of gives you a sense of scale of what is in the collections. The other thing that I hope you see from this is that the Incunabula, as much as the bulk are at Beinecke, it's split among several other special collections on campus. So most of the medical books are medical historical. The British Art Center tends to handle British imprints, et cetera. Very broadly for Beinecke, our collections document the spread of early printing as broadly as possible. Early collecting emphasized rare and unusual presses. And this is why we have, for instance, a few Scandinavian imprints, at least 2 of them on vellum that came in from an 1894 donation of materials from the collection of Comte Paul Rion. The collection is strong in Greek and Latin classics, Italian humanist literature, historical texts, biblical literature and exegesis, and Hebrew printing. And then more recently, we focused on secular vernacular text, illustrated and annotated books, and works by 15th century authors. The other thing I want to call out are fragments, which are both continually acquired and are lingering from acquisitions in years past to figure out what they actually are. So going left to right, the leftmost set is a set of binding fragments we acquired from the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, and we have no idea what is in here. We're working on it, but we don't currently know. Then we have specimen leaves of Incunabula, and finally, this leaf of the Opus Morale that I actually found earlier this week in the papers of Henrietta C. Bartlett, the Shakespeare scholar who used these in her lectures on bibliography in the 1920s at Yale. Very broadly, again, geographic spread. I'm pulling the chart on the right from Wikipedia, which is, again, pulling data from ISTC to give you a sense of what the general production of Incunabula was, whereas our collections, as you can see, skew very heavily Italian. They're strong in German and French imprints, excuse me, as well as Spanish and English. And with English in particular, these are supplemented by the collections of the Yale Center for British Art. I want to very briefly, then having given you a sense of what is here, I want to give you a bit of a sense of the history of these libraries, because I think that will help give a grounding for how things are coming in and what the possibilities are. Yale itself was founded in 1701. This is famously located in a pledging of books. So here in that image on the left is a relief that is used in the decoration of Sterling Memorial Library, which is our main general collections library. And in that image, you see a group of ministers who found Harvard altogether too liberal, And they are gathering books to found a new college, which they do in Connecticut in 1701. Medieval manuscripts enter the collection as early as 1714, but incunabula are much slower. So the earliest one that I've been able to track down is about 1860 as an acquisition. And this is a notable contrast to Harvard, as a for instance, where already in the 18th century, they've begun collecting incunabula. They lose incunabula thanks to a fire and then collect even more incunabula before we even get started. Only in the mid-19th century and kind of later, the later end of that, is there evidence of systematic collecting of early books and manuscripts at all at Yale. And it's only then that they're really starting to think about how can these support teaching in the college, how can they support faculty research, and also the typographic and book design work of the campus printers. And you see this echoed in a line from the university president, A.T. Hadley, in 1909, who says the older college libraries were a means of enjoyment rather than research. Down to 1885, the real research work of the university, as far as it was concerned with books, was chiefly done in the libraries of the professors or special collections of enthusiasts. And a professor could say, I conceive that the chief educational use of a university library is to lend an occasional book to a professor who does not happen to have that book in his own library. So it's a very different kind of project than what we're doing now. And, excuse me. There we go. Things start to shift both with the donation of the Gutenberg in 1926 that you saw on the slide on the previous page, and also with the opening of Sterling Memorial Library. Initially, the collection of rare books and manuscripts there was just a group of items singled out for special care. This old enough to not be stored in open stacks, but eventually developing into a standalone rare book room that has a more robust collections program. And you can see that once they get going, it gets going very quickly. And we suddenly jump to 1,000 incunabula in 1946 for Yale libraries as a whole, 2,000 by 1955. Sorry, I'm operating two computers and sometimes click the wrong arrow, so you have to bear with me. In 1963, we opened Beinecke Library. You can see it under construction here. And to the left, that tower is Sterling Memorial Library and its book stacks. And with the opening of Beinecke, again, the collecting of incunabula continues apace, though you can see we've started to slow down a bit, and it's not quite the moving along at the pace that it did, say, mid-century, although it's still continuing. There we go. And so I've been trying to understand how this gets going in the first place. And in that, I'm relying almost entirely on the two lists that you see here. There are representative pages, or more to both of these. And these come out of our university library records, circa 1900, 1910. They are undated, so I'm guessing a little bit based on when the books discussed here were acquired. The one on the left contains bibliographic descriptions, mostly coming out of a collection that I'll come back to in a moment. And the one on the right seems to be a list of all of the incunabula that were actually in Yale's collections, again, circa 1910. One of the issues of pinning down what is actually here is that what books these are actually corresponding to in the collections now is that the list on the left has no call numbers at all, whereas the list on the right has a different set of call numbers than what we use now. And to the degree that they are recorded, they're recorded on the physical volumes. And in a collection of about 4,000, that becomes very difficult to check by hand. But as I've dug into this, what I've seen seems to be a reflection of the larger trends that I've read about Yale's collections, which is that in the mid-19th century, there's a skepticism about the feasibility of collecting rare materials systematically. And so the earliest acquisitions are driven by donation, and only later do we get purchases from Yale. So to give you a couple of examples, one of the major gifts that we get late in the 19th century is from William Loring Andrews, the American collector. He's also the first librarian of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And he donates a collection of 35 titles in 1894 that are meant to, and I'm quoting from the introduction of his catalog, they're meant to, quote, set before the students of the university as a whole, the more general features of the art of the early printer. With Andrews, at least, we have more of a sense of where he's buying. He's fairly systematic about including his own book plates. He's systematic about entering on the fly leaves, the purchase, the source of the purchase, the cost, very often notes about the binder. And a bulk of about half of the printed volumes that he donates to us come from the Woodhull sale of 1886, in which the library of Michael Woodhull, the English book collector and translator of Euripides, was dispersed. I also quite like William Loring Andrews because his definition of early books is very explicitly not how we would treat Incunabula. And he wants the division to be about 50 years later. This is from the introduction to the catalog. Addison von Namek, who is formerly the university librarian, says that this collection of early printed books presented by William Loring Andrews was formed to illustrate the first century of printing, which is a better boundary for the survey than the half century ending in the year 1500, which is more often chosen. The latter, the so-styled cradle period of the art, is wanting in real definition, being at most a convenient halting place, not a completed stage, whereas at the middle of the 16th century, the printed book of the better class had acquired most of its maturer features and no longer has for us an unfamiliar look. And I appreciate this because, this is not the definition that we operate by any longer, but it does also emphasize that these books are being entered into a university collection. And so there are arguments that are being made that would then be carried on to the students who can think about the history of the book in a context where we do, at least for a while, have a professor teaching bibliography, have a chair of bibliography, and thinking about the history of printing. So if we have William Loring Andrews, who's donating to Yale, we also have this man, James Mason Hoppin, who donates a handful of Incunabula in 1894. In this case, I don't have a printed catalog, so I don't know how many books he actually gives us. There's at least 4 in those catalogs that I've been able to identify so far. James Mason Hoppin was professor of homiletics at Yale in the 1860s and 1870s, and after his retirement was also professor of art history. And he is, at the very least, consistent about his book plates. You can see his name on the left. I also wanted to highlight this book for 2 other reasons. One, many of the books that he donates to us, as opposed to William Loring Andrews buying at the Woodhull sale, Hoppin seems to be getting either directly or indirectly from the Carmelite monastery in Bamberg in the 1840s. And the other thing I want to point out with this is the image you see in the middle, where you have a collation slip pasted into the back of the incunable, that in this case actually has a reasonably robust description for having been done in the 1850s that will tell you where the book comes from. So at the very bottom, you see Gift of James Mason Hoppin, 1894. And unfortunately for the books that were acquired by Yale before about the 1960s, 1970s, that collation slip is often the most complete information and the most complete description we have, the most complete source of information. And as far as I can tell, they're only available in the physical volumes, and not, as we'll see, not all of the descriptions have been updated. So this is one of the other challenges that is facing us here. But I bring up these 2, Hoppin and Loring Andrews, because they're pretty emblematic of the kind of provenance that these early Incunabula have in our collections. They're done by donation with folks who have some kind of connection to the university, often the faculty, but sometimes alumni. And it's only in the early 20th century, really, that you start seeing, or that I've found any traces that the library is actively buying on university funds. This kind of thing will accelerate the further you get into the 20th century. In 1926, I believe the Yale Library Associates is founded, which is a development organization, essentially, where the university will say, these are the kinds of books we're looking for. And these wealthy book collectors will either give the funds or buy the books and then donate them to the institution. And so having mentioned already some of the problems, and just to wrap up here, the kinds of things that we are facing as we're trying to grapple with the provenance of these collections is that very often our Incunabula records in the catalog look like this. I will say the call number does appear in the record just because of the way the display is. It wouldn't fit on comfortably on the PowerPoint. But very often we're looking at records like this. You have no sense of a physical description. There's no provenance information. ISTC isn't included yet. So we're working on it. And this is work that I participated in my previous position as a cataloger, and now Dr. Hannelore Segers has been working through our Incunabula collection systematically. She has updated all of the Belgian imprints, Dutch, Austrian, UK, and is now working through Switzerland. And ideally, what we're going to get to is this kind of more thorough description where you do have the provenance, you do have the bindings, and then you do also have those special collection subjects at the bottom, which would let you figure out what are all of the books that Paul Mellon gave us, what are all of the books that James Mason Hoppin gave us once this set is actually done. But again, this is years and years worth of work that is ahead of us to complete this cataloging. And it does make difficult answering questions like, if you remember the slides I was showing you earlier, where seemingly suddenly between 1940 and 1946, we have this huge jump of about 800 incunabula. I do not currently have an easy way of telling you how those came into the collections. One of the ways that I am trying to do that in the absence of being able to extract directly from the catalog is, again, the work that our students have been doing to go through and figure out what is the documentation, where is all of this stored, and to try to bring them together, in some cases physically, which is what you see an image of here. These are kind of the working Incunabula bib files that we've gotten through so far. And then there's digital duplicates of everything that are more robust, but it is a matter of combing through the printed catalogs that I mentioned, the Yale Library Gazette. There's institutional files, curatorial files, which are distinct from bibliographic files, which are distinct from the correspondence of individual curators, collation slips that are physically in the volumes, and then the documents laid into the volumes themselves. And I'm sure this is a thing that many of you also have to contend with, and I would be grateful for any suggestions you have for how to get through it. And I'll just end on thinking about kind of one of the payoffs of this work, in addition to being able to tell interesting stories out of the collections and thinking about the teaching work we do, being sure that we are confident that we are the rightful owners of the things in the collections. There's also thinking forward to other kinds of projects, and in particular things like material evidence and incunabula and footprints. And I bring these two up together to close because the book on the left has a robust provenance history, thanks to joint effort that we were able to make with both an MEI student that I had and then colleagues in our general collections working through our Hebrew books. And so it will end there. I hope to have given you a broad sense of what is in Yale's collections, very broadly where they came from, and kind of this very early moment in the history, but also a sense of the work we have to do ahead. Thank you.